kind of hard to keep support for a community that once a year there's incidents like them peeing on each other in the streets in San Francisco, right?
Republican politicians and pundits are constantly inundating their fans with propaganda and lies.
We have just seen new polling from Gallup that, as somebody who is both gay and on the right of center politics and a supporter of gay marriage, I was not thrilled to see. This is from Gallup. Record party divide 10 years after same-sex marriage. Republican support has dropped 14 points since 2022. This is a big deal because the previous Gallup polling had a majority of Republicans on board with gay marriage, and I thought we were like moving on from this. But to me, it's pretty clear what's happened here. There's significant backlash against all of the LGBT community because of a lot of the gender extremism and the gays who've gone along with it and the professional gay activists who've gone along with it. Blaire, you're going to have a lot of thoughts on this. I'll turn it over to you. Give us your theory of the case, why Republican support is in decline. And then, Adam, I'll come to you.
You know, it's kind of hard to keep support for a community that once a year there's incidents like them peeing on each other in the streets in San Francisco, right? It's kind of difficult when once a year every major city has to deal with half nude people on the street and people actually having sex on the street, and with the gender extremism too. But particularly when it comes to the gay marriage stuff, you know, I feel like a lot of gay people on the right felt a little more comfortable than they probably should have, just because it's really not just the trans stuff that makes the community look bad. You know, all the children's books on how to use Grindr in middle school. I mean, say what you want, and I criticize trans people all the time. That ain't got nothing to do with trans people. It's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of issues coming from the G, and really not so much the L's and the B's. They're kind of the innocent bystanders. It's really the, you know, the G's and the T's that ruin it for everybody. It's a common sense backlash to the past decade of, and I will use this word because there's a certain point where the word is appropriate, of a lot of legitimate degeneracy. And I don't consider degeneracy to be things that happen between people in their bedrooms. I don't consider degeneracy to be personal choices that people make about their bodies. But when you're doing certain things, that, you know, line crosses. When Biden has a, you know, a trans person stripping on the front lawn of the White House, people get a little bit resentful, especially when
He
you have a
did ban
complete
her.
denial that it's.
He did ban her for that from the White House.
He did ban her, but you know that wouldn't have happened under Trump. So it's kind of like.
Well, he did host Dylan
just,
Mulvaney at the White House for a long interview about how they needed to preserve access to kids' sex changes. So,
right.
Adam,
And you don't get to sterilize children and, you know, have heinous gay pride parades and continue on with the debauchery and there not to be backlash. Not saying I agree with it. I personally, I'll just put it out there, say really quick, I do personally support gay marriage. I have friends that I, you know, support being married, but
Blaire's an ally.
I can see why it's happening too.
But
yes,
Adam, I'll come to you on this, but my question is, it can't just be that Republicans are all big bad bigots and homophobes. And I feel like that's been some on the Democratic side's response to this kind of thing. In 2022, we had like 55%, I believe, of Republicans supporting it. Now we have a huge decline. What is your explanation for that?
I would never make a broad generalization and say that all Republicans are bigots. That's not even my answer. I think like the immediate place, there's a few places my mind goes to. The immediate place my mind goes to is the culture war backlash that we've seen over the past few years. I mean, yes, activists on my side very likely took it too far. In a lot of online spaces in particular, I feel like I saw this a lot online, and that could have pushed people away. But I don't even think that degeneracy is the reason why, as Blaire said, is the reason why gay marriage is dropping or support for gay marriage is dropping. I genuinely think from the bottom of my heart, it's because Republican politicians and pundits are constantly inundating their fans with propaganda and lies about gay and trans Americans. Now, there's a very valid conversation to be had about trans people in sports or gender affirming care for minors. These are conversations to be had. I don't want to like shut that down, but trans Americans make up 0.5% of the population. Is that right, Blaire? Like 0.5%? Yet
it's probably higher. It's probably higher these days. That was like the number before the explosion.
So either way, they consist of like 50% of Republican talking points. There was one trans congresswoman. Her name is Sarah McBride. And this is like the perfect microcosm of all of this. There's one trans congresswoman, and she came into Congress and said, I want to keep my head down. My identity is not going to be something that I'm loud about. Republicans immediately introduced a bill just to target this one person. So Republicans take this one new trans congresswoman and blow this case up and target her, and then it grabs all of these headlines, and then Fox News is talking about it, and then this one trans congresswoman is in the heads of every single Republican who watches Fox News across America, and someone who should just be eating dinner with her family is then worried about Sarah McBride.
So
I don't think it's
Adam,
because of degeneracy.
I get it.
Yeah.
In particular with Sarah McBride, I think they made a big deal out of something that didn't need to be a big deal.
But like, can I expand on that really
I
quickly?
agree with that.
Blaire White even said that Blaire White said something about gay people pissing on the streets of San Francisco. I've heard stuff like this before, that gay people are out on the streets of cities, blah, blah, blah. I live in Chicago. I run my business here. There's not gay people frolicking around the streets, but most conservatives probably think that.
But it doesn't really matter
We're talking about pride
it doesn't
events.
really matter what you've personally seen. It actually is completely irrelevant if you've seen it. These videos go viral every single year for Pride. And I don't know what, if you're straight or if you're gay or whatever, but you probably have maybe a blind spot. This stuff is real. And I understand there is an overfixation on trans people. And I've seen that. And that's one of the things I've always said for my whole career is like, you would think trans people are half the population. And that's part of the reason why I have to speak on this stuff so much. But it's not propaganda if it's really happening.
Yeah.
So when there really are books in schools for middle school that have inappropriate gay acts depicted visually, talk about things like how to use Grindr, it's easy to say, oh, that's propaganda when right-wing politicians are like, we have to get this out of school. But it's the more accurate assessment is like, they're going to use that as propaganda, but it is really happening. It doesn't mean it's a lie because it's being twisted for a political purpose.
Adam, I'll come to you, but let me just add on to what Blaire is saying. I agree, especially like right-wing commentators, the Matt Walshes of the world, they take this stuff and they make it as big as they can, and they go after some trans people in really horrible and personal ways. But I do think the Democrats and whatever broadly defined the left and the activist left have given them a lot of ammunition. Biden did not have to invite Dylan Mulvaney to the White House to talk about preserving sex changes for kids. California put biologically male sex offenders in women's prisons under Gavin Newsom. It's like sometimes they make a big deal out of nothing. They do propaganda, they do fear-mongering, they do demonization on the right, but they're not inventing it out of whole cloth. They gave them a lot to work with. Do you deny that, Adam?
I think that no, I don't deny that. I think that the Democratic Party has been too beholden to our activists for a while now. Maybe since like the Black Square Instagram era, during BLM when people were posting those black squares, probably even before that. Yes, the Democratic Party has been too beholden to activists, and it's cost us a lot of political goodwill among the American people, for sure. But I actually agree with what Blaire White said, how it seems like we largely agree on a few things here. Conservative commentators are taking these edge cases and blowing them up to use them as propaganda. But just going back, I don't know why I keep thinking about this. When you said gay people are peeing on the streets of San Francisco, is that like a real thing that was happening recently?
It's called
yes, it's a real thing. It's a real thing. And especially in San Francisco, it's stuff that you would not be able to legally do unless it was gay pride. And all I'm saying is we showed and we proved that society can reach a point of a consensus of like, okay, gay people can get married. There was a cultural moment for about a decade where no one had any issue with LGBT people. And now it's swinging backwards.
Well,
and I think it just misses the mark to not be able, I'm not saying you, but anyone who doesn't, possess the capability to understand that some of that backlash is a direct result of the actions of people within the community. It's about personal responsibility. It's about, why are we hanging our hat on sterilizing children? It's the most insane thing. And there's deserved backlash. There really is.
I can understand where the backlash comes from, for sure. I see it on my side too. I am straight, so I don't go to gay pride parades or anything, but I genuinely do think that we can all agree on a few things. Number one, there's degeneracy among any group of people ever. So straight people, like Christian people, Muslims, whatever, there's going to be degeneracy. I think part of the problem too, what you'd have to demonstrate is that gay people or trans people are acting degenerate out in public at a higher rate. Without demonstrating that, it does seem like conservative commentators then will pull these videos and blow them up. So like over the past year.
Also, no, because
can I say over the past year, there's probably a straight couple that's pissed on each other out in public too, but that wouldn't get blown up in the same way, would it?
100%, but that doesn't get defended by other straight people like, oh, it's just straight culture. Whereas you do it in the gay world and, oh, it's just gay culture. Oh, it's just gay culture to wear a dog fetish sex mask in your lieutenant photo. and
Okay,
that's
but
just normal, and we don't criticize that because that's gay. You know what I mean? There's a lot of people even that defended the trans woman that stripped in front of the White House because it's a queer event, and queerness is about liberation and whatever. It's
Yeah,
like
Adam,
but
there's
I'm
a
sure
lot of
Blaire,
permissibility. There's a lot of permission within the LGBT community. And you don't have to even think about all these different examples. It's like just hanging your hat on sterilizing kids. That is a movement that deserves some whiplash and some backlash from society. You can't just pretend like that's a normal position and then being like, why are people statistically liking us less? It's like, well, you do sterilize children. So
this
we
is
actually don't have to look much farther than that.
I reject some of this framing here about sterilizing children. That's a different conversation. Do you think the
What
vast
do you
majority
reject
do you
about it?
reject
Because
it?
that's what they do.
Wait, really quickly, can I ask you one question and we'll get to that? Do you think the
Okay.
vast majority of gay people would say that peeing on streets is okay?
No, I think the activist class
You're
probably
very
would
like
defend
you're
it.
very like micro thinking, like you like to hang your hat on one little thing I say. Probably
No,
not
'cause-
if you polled them like, is it okay to do this specific thing? However, if you have an understanding of gay culture and if you've ever been within its vicinity, you can see that there is a different culture of what's respectable and what's not. There's a different culture, and that culture plays out just like Democrats don't like to acknowledge there's a difference between white culture and black culture. And some of the bad things and the bad statistics we see out of the black community is a direct result of their own behavior. So in my line, there's a thing called personal responsibility. So we don't act like fools on the street after we've gained all this acceptance because that
Yeah.
causes it to
I
backslide.
got to add to that.
And
what
there's an
Blaire
overt
said.
fixation on it, but it's not out of nothing.
Yeah, so even then, even Adam, and I probably do disagree with you, but if I were to accept your notion that, well, straight people do degenerate stuff at the same rate of gay people having been maligned for so many years and having such bias have a responsibility to still have more message discipline and stop feeding into this narrative, even if it's the same rates, which I do doubt. I would say that, but I want to get into the point that you said there. I do think Democrats have really tied themselves to, we are the party that thinks child sex changes, medical transitions should be legal. Biden was unequivocal about that. He said something about surgeries late in his presidency where he was attacked by activists for even saying that. But the idea that like 11-year-olds should be put on puberty blockers if they're confused about their gender and then put on cross-sex hormones, the mainstream Democratic position is, yeah, let's keep that legal. And most Americans strongly abhor that position. You said you don't accept that framing? Why?
The framing that I didn't like is Blaire kept using the word sterilizing, which I think is very
which
loaded.
is an accurate word for
I
what
think it's a
happened.
little bit
but
loaded.
not wrong.
It's not loaded at
Okay,
all.
well,
And
okay,
if you're
just-
saying
okay.
it's loaded with emotions, you're in charge of keeping your own emotions in check. It sterilizes children.
Well, let's let Adam.
And how do I
let's
know
let
that?
Adam,
Hi, I'm trans.
let's
I
let
know what
Adam give
happens
his
during trans
response.
procedures and medications that trans people take.
I'm
And
not
when
going to
you-
pretend to know more about this procedure than you, but Brad asked me 1 second ago, you asked me a question about, whether the Democratic Party has tied ourselves to this position. I think what most Democrats would say, if you ask that question, is this decision should be kept between a board of doctors or a board of psychiatrists, a doctor, a parent, and a kid.
And that's
Isn't
a
that what-
horrible premise. And that's a horrible premise. It's the
Can
same
you-
reason why Christian extremists aren't allowed to not take their kids to get treatment for cancer.
Can you
if
give
they
me
have
your
cancer.
prescription then? I'm curious, like, what's
Say
your
that one more
rebuttal
time.
to that?
Say that one more time.
Can you give me your prescription? What's your rebuttal to that? So you believe, let me just
My
clarify.
prescription is that when it comes to children, the state should step in when things that irreparably damage children due to medical decisions made by parents that are unnecessary.
Adam,
These are doctors.
Adam, let me
usually,
ask
not
you a
It
question
doesn't.
parents.
here
It
that I
doesn't
think
matter. You can find a doctor to. I promise. Maybe you don't know this, but you can find a doctor if you look hard enough to do literally anything you want to do. If you're willing to pay for it and go to a certain black market or do whatever you want to
Yeah.
do. So the problem is when there are procedures being legalized for children that don't make sense, that sterilize them for life. And doesn't matter how you feel about the word, it's accurate. Sterilizes them for life, physically alters them for life.
Everyone agrees that some things are beyond the pale of what's left for parents and doctors. For example, I imagine you would be supportive of banning gay conversion therapy for kids. I'm supportive of banning it because I don't think you have an unlimited right to do whatever you want with your doctor. So that's the response to your question. Now give
Mhm.
kind of your view or your rebuttal.
I would like to ban gay conversion therapy, and I wouldn't like doctors to be able to cut off people's arms either. That's something that people like, an argument that people give a lot.
Right. So why should they be able to remove any other parts of their body or sterilize themselves for life? You can't even go and get a procedure that sterilizes you as a 17-year-old if you're not, say you're not trans, you're just a regular 17-year-old girl who's like, I don't ever want to have kids. You can't even find a doctor to do that for you.
There's a plurality of, there are a ton of studies showing that gay conversion therapy is harmful. It does not work. It is terrible. There are 0 studies showing that cutting off your arm is helpful. The trans debate is still being studied actively. So the idea—
I'm going to let you know right now, if you need a study to tell you if a child at 11 or 12 years old can decide if they want to have kids or not for the rest of their life.
Do you think gender dysphoria is real?
Do I think gender dysphoria is real? Yeah, I have it. Yeah, I've suffered with that.
So what's your prescription? That was my question.
And I also know that I was not able to consent at 11 or 12 if I could have kids in the future or not. And it's a completely irrational, it's a completely irrational take.
The prescription is to wait till they're 18, Adam, and then they can do it.
Okay,
if
there's
you
a few
can't go
things.
get your
First of all,
tubes tied as a regular 17-year-old girl, you can't go and say, I feel like a boy, and so I want my breasts removed. You cannot
Blaire said
do
something
that.
earlier. She said, I don't know if you know this, but you can find a doctor to prescribe anything. Something
Yeah,
to
you
that
absolutely
effect.
can.
Do you think that if I were a parent with a kid who has gender dysphoria, I could go and just find a doctor to prescribe a sex change for my kid? Like, do you genuinely think I could do that?
Hormones?
Like,
it's not that hard anymore.
Have you ever heard, sir, I feel like there's several like world bubbles that are being burst here. There's a black market for surgery. There's child sex trafficking. I promise you, if you can sex traffic a child to Epstein's Island, you can find somebody to give your child hormones or surgeries.
I'm sorry, but what does the black market have to do with the government stepping in and stopping? We're talking about whether the government should step in and stop that. A black market is a black market because you're going outside the government.
You just said, are you saying you can find a doctor? Yes, you can, no matter how.
I'm not talking about black market doctors.
However, it is still the state's place. However, it is still the state's place to say, A, at the very least, taxpayers should not be paying for this stuff. And 2, you do not get to legally go to any doctor and force them to do some sort of treatment on a child that is unethical or does not make sense. Just like you cannot go and deny taking and refuse to take your child to go get treatment for cancer if they're dying from cancer. Just like you cannot get them, like you brought up, to get them to remove any other kind of limb that is vital for their survival and future.
So Blaire, I agree with you, but I do want to hear Adam out more. Adam, and
I just want to clarify what I was saying earlier. When I was talking about taking your child to a doctor, I'm talking about doctors who are licensed by the state. When you talk about black market doctors, that is inherently like outside of the state. Like, black market doctors are going to be subverting whatever the laws there are. So when we're talking 100%. About the law, when we're talking about the laws regarding trans children or children with gender dysphoria,
it should be illegal as well.
Okay, but if it's illegal, then you bring up black market. So I'm going to remove the black market. Do you think that if I were a parent and I had a kid with gender dysphoria, I could just go find any licensed doctor to do sex changes on my kid?
To prescribe hormones or puberty blockers isn't that hard. You could go and after an appointment.
So?
Yeah, and up until very recently, you could get the various trans surgeries that exist for your minor child in most states.
So you think it's not that hard to get this hormone therapy? So when we see a massive... As an underage person, you said that you can go.
It's not that hard. We'll take a few appointments.
Okay, it's not that hard.
Can.
My question is, aren't there polls showing that like 16% of Gen Zers are LGBTQ and like 7% are trans? Where are all these LGBTQ trans Gen Zers at?
A lot of them identify as non-binary and don't actually medically transition or do anything of the sort. A lot of them just claim to be bisexual.
Well, that's the first thing, is that your side has completely politicized and destroyed the actual medical concept of trans and what trans people are. You've completely obliterated it for political purposes. You completely, I know earlier we were talking about how Republicans overfixate on trans stuff, but to pretend as if that is not because the Democrat Party has propped up trans as their leading issue for the better part of a decade, up until very recently, where now a few of them like yourself are willing to say, oh yeah, I'm not too glued to that. Well, they were for a long time.
Trans was our leading issue?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big issue for Democrats.
Trans people were used as a major political football and still are to this day. That's why we're having this conversation for the better part of a decade. And both sides were utilizing them in various ways. and none of it benefited actual trans people. So yes, there is an explosion of population of kids, especially Gen Z, that identify as trans. I'm not saying all of them are going and getting surgeries and actually are what I think is truly trans, but there are a lot of them because they have this political notion of what trans is, and they're sucked into what the internet says trans is. And then a certain portion of them, yes, in most states in recent times have gone and have been able to get surgeries and hormones extremely, extremely easy. And so when it comes to whether or not we should be covering for that as taxpayers or the state should be paying for that, the answer is absolutely no.
Adam,
We shouldn't be paying for that. And if kids are able to get hormones extremely easily, that is terrible. I would never, most liberals.
It's not
most,
if though. It's not
most
if though.
Democrats.
And it's
Okay,
important
can I
for
walk
people
you
to
through
move
how
on
I
from the
view
if.
yeah,
because
Adam,
it is.
give Adam a minute, Blaire, to walk through his position on this and his thinking.
Can I just walk through how I have seen this conversation go? So we started off with me saying something to the effect of, the liberal position is that these decisions should be kept between a parent, a doctor, and a child. And I think Blaire's rebuttal was you can find a doctor that can prescribe any of this stuff for anybody,
No,
right?
that's not my rebuttal. My
Oh.
rebuttal was that is not, you can't take that to infinity. There are
There are
still
limits.
parameters within that, because if you use that argument, then you can get to the point where you're cutting kids' limbs off.
No,
or
no,
doing
no, because
whatever.
there are no doctor would ever actually cut a child's limb off, but a doctor would prescribe
Oh
hormones.
my God, they
because there-
already are. They're cutting off breasts and they're cutting off
Limbs?
penises of minors.
Well, those aren't
There's-
limbs,
Yes,
but I
pick-
get your
pick-
point.
There are certain limbs you're allowed to legally cut off and some you're not. But at
based
that
on
point, it's
study.
like, okay, then it's a
The
matter of
reason
if,
you're not allowed to cut off. How many studies are there showing you can cut off an arm and it's fine?
dude, you're
None.
very like appeal to authority. You're very like, what's the
No,
number I
there's
can
not good
Google right
evidence,
now?
Adam.
There's also real life.
Okay.
There's real life.
So
And
I
if you
understand
think
that.
that a child can consent to removing their breasts at 13, you're an insane person.
I don't think. Okay, how many children have removed their breasts at 13?
Not a
first
lot,
of all,
but
can we
no.
Why
talk
does it
about
matter the
numbers
exact
here?
number? There have been tens of thousands of trans surgeries on minors in the past few years. Yes, I don't have the exact number. Not everything is just like, well, the Google says that this is the percentage.
the
There are
insurance
kids
violence,
having this
though.
done, and should taxpayers pay for it? No. And beyond that, should it be happening with minors at all? That's the second
So,
question.
guys,
It's
I'm
not
going to
always just the one thing.
reclaim the
There's a
floor
second
here.
question.
So the point is, Adam, that it's not a huge number, but there have been thousands of these surgeries. We see it from the insurance filings, and those don't even capture the ones that were paid for out of pocket. I understand your point about having it be between a parent and a doctor. I'm a parents' rights person for sure, but it's not unlimited. And when you bring up studies, the truth is that there is no solid high quality evidence showing that these things are safe and effective. There are some very low quality studies, but the systematic reviews of the evidence conducted by the University of York, conducted by Dr. Hilary Cass, and many others. The HHS just did one that was actually, whatever you think of RFK, this was actually a very serious report. And to prescribe or endorse or allow a treatment that is so experimental and has such severe consequences without extremely solid data backing it up. Now, you could argue it'd be unethical even with that data, but the precautionary idea is to never allow this stuff without ample evidence, and we don't have that evidence, Adam.
There's not even good studies for how this stuff affects adults. The amount of trans people that I've met and I know and that I see talking in the discourse publicly on the internet about, and finding out for the first time certain medical complications they have all of a sudden because they got this surgery that even their surgeon wasn't informed on. There's not even good data on how this affects adults, nonetheless, children who are still developing. And then for me, it's not even if there's complications or if something goes wrong. If the surgery goes completely right and this child is now sterilized for life, that also is wrong. And you just can't do that with kids. It's really not that complicated. And why it took Democrats until, summer 2025 for maybe 40% of them to be like, maybe we can, give a little ground on the trans kid thing is just crazy.
But it sounds like you're still saying it should be legal, Adam.
Should it be legal? Okay, so here's the thing. There should be a lot more research. I can concede that. There needs to be a lot more research. But yes, at the end of the day, it should be legal. I don't like the idea of doctors not being able to prescribe something because, for example, with Adderall, there is still a lot of research to be done on the way Adderall affects 12 to 16-year-olds in their heart very long term. Yet
It's
doctors still.
demonic that kids are put on Adderall. It's demonic.
So there are conversations to be had here as well. You can talk about Adderall. Should Adderall be illegal? I would say no. It shouldn't be illegal to prescribe Adderall to kids. Now, what should happen is, a lot of times this conversation happens and Republicans frame it as if I would be okay with a kid walking in and getting gender affirming care with, like, in the snap of a fingers. I would want there to be a board of psychiatrists, a doctor, agreement from the parents, and this board of psychiatrists needs
And
to
you
be
would
basing
want
their
that, but
work.
that's not the
case.
requirement.
Can I
I promise
finish?
you, there is no safeguards. It's not a matter of what you would want.
Adam
There are
finish,
no
though. Let Adam
safeguards
finish,
for
Blaire.
this
Let
stuff.
Adam
I'm
finish.
talking about prescriptive. In an ideal reality, this is what I would want. Now, a lot of liberals would make the argument that this is already how it works, that you can't just walk in.
And it's not.
I want to rehash this argument we had earlier, because Blaire said something to the effect of, I keep saying that because I don't want to misquote you, but you were like, you can find the doctor to prescribe you anything. But when we're talking about the laws in the country, we're not talking about black market doctors, because they are inherently subverting the law.
I
So I want to ask,
know.
can
The
you find a
point
doctor
is-
to prescribe any kid gender or hormone therapy? Because I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
We would see way higher rates.
I mean, so for example, a teenager can walk into Planned Parenthood in many states and walk out with a prescription for testosterone. Yeah, that's a thing.
It's extremely easy. You can go to Planned Parenthood. There's, endocrinologists in every major city that does this. Like, this stuff has been going on in red states up until very, very recently, which is how you know it's rampant and way even easier in blue states.
But a teenager walking into Planned Parenthood with testosterone is different than the argument you guys are making about castration and chopping off limbs.
Well, no,
would
it's not, because the medications cause chemical castration. So the word castration still applies. And again, doesn't really matter how anyone feels about that. It is what it is. It's objective. And that's part of the important understanding for whether or not a drug or a treatment should be illegal or legal for a child, is moving past well, that's loaded language. Okay, well, how about we look at the actual literal meaning of the language? Because so long as we're just like so afraid because of the emotions attached to it and we don't actually understand it, we don't understand that it doesn't matter how you feel about the kid being sterilized or not. It's not a debate. It's a fact that it happens, whether it's chemical or physical. That's a fact.
Well, no, you guys are the ones saying that I'm basing my argument off of emotions, but you guys are using all of these loaded words like chopping off limbs.
These are not loaded. They're literal. It's your own imbalanced emotion making you guys feel that. They're not loaded. They're objective.
Wait, Blaire, I have a question. If there were studies showing with 100% certainty that giving kids hormone therapy decreases the rate of suicidality by like a huge rate, would you still be okay with, or would you be okay?
No, because if you can't figure out another way to keep your child from committing suicide, there's other things to be considered.
So what if there was a 100%?
You don't get to take away a child's right to reproduce and to make that decision for themselves later in life. I'm sorry. And if you want to do that, I'm going to need you to start at why 17-year-old women, and even actually there are cases of like 21-year-old women being denied getting their tubes tied. If you want, you need to start there if you're going to start talking about how younger people should be able to do that, because
in a hypothetical
you guys like to
world,
limit it to just like the actual trans affirming care, and you don't actually understand what's under the umbrella of that. And if someone says words like taking off a body part, again, it's your feelings that that's a loaded phrase. That has nothing to do with reality. That has nothing to do with my intent in using it. I'm being very literal and objective, and that's not arguable. So you can not like how it's worded. That doesn't change the reality. The only thing that changes the reality is making a morally based decision upon what should be happening in reality. And minors cannot consent to sex or changing their sex.
That's the argument, Adam, is that even if so first off, there aren't studies. Even the ACLU's lead attorney arguing for the Supreme Court, a trans man named Chase Strangio, admitted that there is not actual evidence, high quality evidence, showing that these treatments for minors reduce suicide. But say that there were, the ethical question of consent still remains. And the vast majority of Americans really think this is stuff that is just beyond the pale. I think Democrats are slowly starting to evolve on this issue, some of them, but unless they can come out hard against, I know you're right. It's not a super common thing. It's not in every school, in every town, but it's such a strong moral issue, and you can blame loaded language, but it's also, there's very key things that tug at people's heartstrings at play here. Unless Democrats can adopt the full stop position of, we support trans people, we support trans adults, but 18 for all medical treatments that can't be reversed. I think Democrats are screwed on that issue, Adam.
And by the way, the refusal of the left to, up until very recently, some of them are, like I said, giving ground, but the complete like arrogant denial of that on the left's part for so many years now has led to so much backlash against trans adults, to the point where now the general society doesn't even want to think about ethics as it regards to trans adults and adults doing what they want with their bodies. The trans kid issue is now synonymous with the phrase transgender or the phrase transsexual. And it was so not always like that.
Yeah.
There was a time where the concept of a trans child was like, what is that?
Adam,
It
final
wasn't a
word to
thing.
you. Then we're going to close things out on this issue. Final word to you, Adam.
Can I use my final word to ask you guys a question, hypothetically? Who do you think spent more time talking about trans Americans on the campaign trail, Kamala or Trump?
Republicans, for sure.
Trump, for sure.
Can you
And
name
that
me
has
like
no
one?
bearing on if there's a problem to be addressed or not, or what moral side is the correct one.
We
That's
talked
actually
about
irrelevant.
we talked about throughout this whether the Democrats for the past decade have caused a lot or have pushed a lot of their platform to revolve around trans or gay people. And the original prompt was something about GOP gay marriage numbers. So I'm just taking it back a little bit to the party's top-down support, if we want to go back to talking about top-down support for things. I think that the Republicans are the ones turning this into an issue on the broad stage. But yes, of course, Democrats went too far with it. There are valid conversations to be had about trans people in sports, about hormone therapy, and yeah, that's my
Okay.
close.
Well,
Republicans
we'll
didn't
leave
even
it
know what
there.
a trans person was before 2015.
We will leave it
And
there.
that seems like a bad thing for you guys, right?
I promise you it's not. And that's just, respectfully, you just don't really understand that. And that's expected because you're not trans. But I promise you life was better for trans people when they were not the topic of every news headline and not being used as a political football. And many trans people say that, maybe not on Reddit or whatever circles you're in, but trans people, I know the conversation right now is, I want to go back to when no one even knew what we were.
Wait,
Not
who is
when-
using trans people as a political football in this campaign cycle in particular?
Okay,
Which one?
Micro thinking and macro. I already admitted that
What
during
do you mean micro versus macro?
during this last election cycle. You are right that Republicans talked about it more, but that's not the only thing that exists. You don't get to limit a topic to, well, during this time period, when there's a larger picture here of Democrats putting trans people up and propping them up in ways that were counterproductive to people's tolerance towards them.
Democrats
putting
could take it away.
Putting a naked trans
Listen,
person on the White House lawn,
final-
putting Dylan Mulvaney in the White House saying that he wants to sterilize kids, putting books about how to use Grindr in schools, all of those things, right? When you look at the macro, not just the during the election cycle, that causes resentment.
Adam,
on a
Republicans
cultural
couldn't
level.
have made a big deal of it so successfully. Like that ad about Kamala Harris's for they, them was so effective, according to the polls, if Democrats just changed their radical positions and took it off the table, right? That's my argument to you.
I don't even know if Democrats came out with what was Kamala's radical position on trans people, other than the 2019 ACLU clip, obviously.
That's her position. That she never.
She wasn't campaigning on that, though. Should she have denounced that? That's what you're
Yes,
saying?
and she should have said that I do think child sex changes should be legally prohibited, and then after 18, I support trans adults' right to do whatever they
She
want.
could have denounced that clip. I want to say one final thing, and this is my final statement for real this time. Blaire said that I'm engaging in micro thinking, but I was responding directly to the question about GOP support for gay marriage dropping over the past 5 years in particular.
Yeah,
So
but,
Let Adam
so
finish.
5
Let her finish.
years. If you
years
limited
or
it to the
so.
election cycle and you just said the last 5 years, which is a lot longer than the last election cycle.
Let Adam finish.
When we're
now.
looking at when we're looking at the past 5 years or so, and we're talking about whether gay people are being too degenerate or whether Republicans are constantly talking about trans people in the headlines, it's clearly the latter. Republican either pundits or politicians are carpet bombing the Republican voters with lies and propaganda about trans Americans. They think like one of my first ever viral
What
clips.
lies? Can you
One of
name
my first ever viral
specifically
clips
what
was-
lies though?
One of my first ever viral clips was me at a Trump rally. I've been to over 50 different Trump rallies, and I have very respectful conversations. And I asked this Trump supporter, what percent of Americans do you think are transgender? And he says 20%. You can find this clip. This Republican person thinks 20% of Americans are transgender. I have a question for Blaire. Is that because 1 in 5 people he walks past are transgender, or is that because he's consuming right-wing propaganda?
To pretend as if the media presence of trans people is isolated to right-wing lies and propaganda rather than not put in every movie where they're not supposed to be, with characters being swapped out for trans, with Dylan Mulvaney being at the White House, with a naked person being at the White House. Again, the reason I say you keep engaging in micro thinking is because you take one little thing and you're like, do you think this reason is because of that? There's a bigger picture to how things happen, like support for things going in a different direction, more or less. There's a bigger picture. And to pretend as if Republicans who didn't even know trans people existed a decade ago have been the only ones participating in using trans people as a political football is completely ignorant.
Yeah, I think
It's
we're not going to get
ignorant.
beyond this. I can see what both of you are saying. Adam, I agree that the right makes a bigger issue out of this than it is, and sometimes demonizes, sometimes pushes exaggerated or untrue stories. But the Democrats, the activist class, and the transgender community have given them a lot of ammunition they didn't have to give them. And we will leave it there. I want to thank you both for your time for this conversation, for keeping it substantive, keeping it civil. Everybody, check out their channels linked below. They're both huge on YouTube, both producing tons of interesting content. Blaire and Adam, thank you both so much for coming on.
Thank you. That was fun.
Thank you. Have a nice day.